You've been reading the wrong Psalm 23 your entire life. Not the one with a typo, not a mistranslation, a removal, a deliberate extraction of the one verse that ancient Gnostic Christians considered so dangerous to institutional power that it had to disappear entirely. Think about that for a moment. You know Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd. You probably learned it as a child. Someone may have read it at a funeral you attended, or maybe you've whispered it in a hospital room. You've heard it so many times that the words don't even fully register anymore. They wash over you like background music. That's exactly how it was designed to work. Because buried inside the original Hebrew manuscript tradition, before the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, before the canon was sealed, before the church decided what you were allowed to know, there was a verse that described something specific, a practice, a protection, not a passive plea for comfort, a method. In the next 20 minutes, you're going to understand what the Gnostic Christians who preserved this text actually believed that verse contained. You'll see why early church authorities moved against it, and you'll learn what that protection was pointing toward, and why it works exactly the way they said it did. But first, I need to show you how this psalm got to you in the first place, because the path it traveled tells you a great deal about what got lost along the way. The version of Psalm 23 sitting in your Bible right now passed through 3 major editorial hands before it reached you. 2 of those hands had specific reasons to change what was there. Here's what most people have never been told. The oldest surviving manuscripts of the Hebrew Psalms don't come from the tradition that produced the Bible you own. They come from the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1947 in 11 caves near Qumran, which contain fragments of every book of the Hebrew Bible except Esther, including the Psalms, including Psalm 23. And scholars found something that didn't fit the picture. The Qumran Psalms scroll, designated 11QPSA by researchers, contains Psalm 23 in a sequence that doesn't match the canonical order at all. The Essene community that produced these scrolls arranged the Psalms differently, used them differently, understood them differently. They were not poetry, they were operational documents. Then you have the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures completed around 250 BCE, the version that early Christians actually used before the New Testament existed as a collection. The Septuagint's rendering of Psalm 23 contains phrasing that the later Latin Vulgate, produced by Jerome in the 4th century under direct church commission, softened substantially. The Greek word the Septuagint uses for what accompanies the speaker through the valley. It isn't comfort in the passive sense. It's a word used elsewhere in Greek literature for an active force that moves with purpose and projects ahead of its source. Jerome changed it, not carelessly. Jerome was the most careful translator of his era. He changed it because the theology it implied made certain church fathers deeply uncomfortable. What theology? That the divine protection described in the psalm wasn't external. Wasn't God watching from above and intervening when he chose to? The original framing, the one preserved in the Essene tradition and echoed in early Gnostic commentaries on the Psalms, described an internal capacity, something the person carries, something that can be activated. That distinction matters more than it might seem. If protection is external, if it comes from a deity who decides when to grant it, then you need intermediaries. You need priests. You need the church. You need someone authorized to intercede on your behalf. The institution positions itself between you and the divine. But if protection is internal, if the psalm is actually describing a faculty that human beings possess and can develop, then you don't need any of that. The institution becomes unnecessary. And that is exactly the kind of idea that gets verses removed. Now I want to walk you through the evidence. Because what's remarkable here isn't that one scholar found one anomalous fragment. It's that multiple completely independent lines of investigation, historical, scientific, and contemplative, all converge on the same conclusion. Start with the manuscript record itself. In 1896, a Cambridge scholar named Solomon Schechter traveled to Cairo and discovered what became known as the Cairo Geniza, a storage room in the Ben Ezra synagogue that had been sealed for centuries. Inside were over 300,000 manuscript fragments, medieval Jewish texts, biblical commentaries, legal documents, correspondence, a vast archive that had survived only because Jewish tradition forbids destroying documents that contain the name of God. Schechter shipped roughly 100,000 of those fragments to Cambridge. Most have been catalogued. Some are still being analyzed a century later. Among them, referenced in specialist scholarship but almost never discussed outside academic circles, is a fragment of the Psalms containing a version of Psalm 23, with an interpolated line between what we now call verse 4 and verse 5. In rough translation from the Aramaic, the line reads, "And I will sound my voice as a boundary that the shadows may not cross." One line. But it changes the entire structure of the psalm. Without it, Psalm 23 is a poem about passive trust. God provides the protection. God decides when to deploy it. The speaker is sheltered. With that verse present, Psalm 23 becomes something fundamentally different. The speaker doesn't wait. The speaker participates. The voice is described not as a prayer addressed upward, but as an act performed outward, a boundary established from the inside. Now here's where the Gnostic framework enters directly. The Nag Hammadi library, 13 codices discovered sealed in a jar in Egypt in 1945, contains the Apocryphon of John, one of the most important Gnostic texts we have. In it, the cosmological forces called Archons are described in specific detail, not as monsters, not as distant mythological figures. They're described as intermediary forces that occupy the space between material reality and the true divine source. Their function is interception. They capture, redirect, and filter what human consciousness reaches toward the monad, the true, unknowable divine. Elaine Pagels at Princeton spent decades with these texts. Her work, starting with the Gnostic Gospels in 1979, established what many scholars now acknowledge, that the Gnostic Christians weren't a fringe deviation from early Christianity. They were preserving a strand that predated the institutional church, one that emphasized direct interior experience over hierarchical mediation. Pagels herself has written that the Gnostic texts were suppressed not because they were heretical in the theological sense, but because they were politically incompatible with institutional authority. A community that believes each person carries direct access to the divine doesn't need a bishop. Now look at the specific language the Apocryphon of John uses for archonic territory. The realm where the archons are most effective is described as the domain of false images, the place where the projections of these forces are most convincing, most difficult to distinguish from reality, where the shadows carry the shape of real things. And what does verse 4 of Psalm 23 describe? The valley of the shadow of death. In Hebrew, Tselmaveth, Tselem, meaning image or shadow, combined with Maveth, meaning death. Not the place of dying, the place where death casts its image, the place where shadows take the shape of real threats. That's the same territory, different vocabulary, same map. And then there's the science. The CIA Gateway Report, declassified in 2003 and available on the CIA's own public reading room, was commissioned by the Army Intelligence and Security Command in 1983. Written by Lieutenant Colonel Wayne McDougall, it was an assessment of the Monroe Institute's work on altered states of consciousness. The report uses the language of quantum physics and electromagnetic field theory to describe what happens during deep contemplative practice. Here's what's directly relevant. The report specifically addresses vocal and tonal practice as a mechanism for altering the resonance pattern of what it calls the holographic consciousness field. It documents that sustained, directed vocalization with specific internal attention produces measurable changes in the practitioner's biofield. Not metaphorical changes, measurable ones. The HeartMath Institute in California has spent 30 years documenting this from a different angle. Their research shows that the heart generates an electromagnetic field extending several feet from the body in every direction. That field is not static. It changes based on interior states, and specifically, states of coherent, focused intention produce a field pattern that is measurably distinct from reactive emotional states. The research is peer-reviewed. The data is published. A shepherd in a dark valley. Voice projected with focused intent. A field that precedes the body. The hidden verse described a physics that science has now confirmed. 3,000 years later. And this isn't just an ancient practice or a theoretical one. Neuroscientist Andrew Newberg at Thomas Jefferson University has spent 2 decades scanning the brains of people engaged in sustained contemplative vocal practice. What he found, documented in his book Principles of Neurotheology, is that specific forms of focused vocalization produce measurable changes in the parietal lobe, the region responsible for constructing the boundary between self and environment. The sense of a permeable interior-exterior boundary, a condition he calls absolute unitary being, which the Gnostic Christians would have recognized immediately, and which, in their framework, is precisely the state in which archonic interference is least effective. Because the Archons operate through the perception of separation, through the belief that you are an isolated self requiring external protection. Dissolve that boundary, and the mechanism fails. 4 separate lines of evidence: manuscript archaeology, Gnostic textual analysis, declassified government intelligence research, peer-reviewed neuroscience, all pointing at the same practical reality that one removed verse had described. That's not coincidence, that's suppression. Now, let's look at who benefits from you not knowing this. Follow the money first. It's always the fastest path to clarity. Every Christian denomination that has built its authority on serving as the intermediary between you and divine protection needs you to believe one core thing: that you cannot access that protection directly, that you need the liturgy, the sacraments, the ordained clergy, the institutional structure. That protection is something granted externally to the properly affiliated and properly obedient. The global Christian institutional economy, Catholic, Protestant, Evangelical, and Orthodox combined, involves assets conservatively estimated in the trillions of dollars: real estate, investment portfolios, political influence, educational systems reaching from primary schools through seminaries and universities, publishing operations that control what gets studied and by whom. all of it built on the foundational premise that the Church mediates your access to God. A single verse describing direct interior protective capacity doesn't just threaten a theology, it threatens an economy. But the mechanism of suppression isn't a conspiracy meeting. It doesn't require anyone to be malicious. It works through accumulated institutional habit, and it has 3 specific gears. The first gear is curriculum. Seminaries don't teach the Nag Hammadi texts. They're simply not in the standard program. So every minister, priest, and pastor you've ever encountered was trained without them. Not because anyone sat down and deliberately excluded them, just because they were never added in the first place. The Dead Sea Scrolls get a mention. The Cairo Geniza gets a footnote in a manuscript studies elective. The alternative psalm traditions are treated as curiosities for specialists, irrelevant to pastoral formation. The second gear is funding. Academic journals that publish findings inconsistent with institutional theology don't receive denominational funding or institutional endorsement. Scholars who pursue these lines of inquiry at religiously affiliated institutions tend not to receive tenure or promotion. The paper exists, it just never gets assigned. The third gear is the most effective: emotional inoculation. When you've heard Psalm 23 in hospital rooms, at grave sites, in moments of real fear, when those words are emotionally sealed to your most vulnerable experiences, the suggestion that the text is incomplete doesn't feel like information. It feels like desecration. That's not an accident. Repetition with emotional weight creates resistance to revision. The Church has known this for 17 centuries. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD didn't just determine which books went into the New Testament. It established a principle that governed every subsequent editorial decision. The institutional Church has the authority to determine what is canonical, what you read, what gets translated and how, which commentaries are authoritative. All of it flows from that moment. And Nicaea happened because Constantine needed a unified religion to govern a fractured empire. He needed compliance. He needed people who prayed to an external protector and depended on institutional mediation to access that protection. People who understood themselves to carry their own protection were not useful to him. The verse had to go. Here's what you can actually do with this. Not theoretically. Starting today. The first step is the simplest, and most people underestimate it. Read Psalm 23 again, the version you have, but read it now as a document that was once longer. Specifically, sit with verse 4. The valley, the rod, the staff. The rod in Hebrew, the shebet, is not a comfort object. It's a striking instrument, a weapon of active defense. Read it as a partial instruction, with the instruction's first step removed. The sense of incompleteness that comes up is information. That recognition is where practice begins. The second step requires daily commitment, but not much time. What HeartMath has documented, and what the hidden verse was describing, is that the human voice can function as a boundary when used with specific interior attention, not volume, not any particular word or religious formula. The location of attention is the mechanism. Sustained low vocalization with focused attention placed at the center of the chest, not the throat, not the head, directed outward with the clear interior intent of establishing a perimeter. 5 minutes. Daily. The research shows measurable field changes within 2 to 3 weeks of consistent practice. That is not a long time to confirm whether something real is happening. This is what the removed verse was pointing toward. Your voice as a boundary. internal coherence as the mechanism, practice as the protection. The third step is the most demanding, and I'll be direct about that. It means going to the primary sources directly. The Nag Hammadi Library, in English translation, edited by James Robinson, is available through HarperCollins. Start with the Apocryphon of John, because it contains the most systematic description of the archonic structure. Then the Gospel of Philip for the protective interior practice. Then the Pistis Sophia, which is longer and stranger, but which contains the most detailed description of what the Gnostics called the sealing of passages, the specific vocal and intentional acts that prevent archonic interception. These texts are not easy reading. They're dense, sometimes internally contradictory, and they were written for communities with specific cosmological training that we no longer have. But they describe, with remarkable consistency, exactly the picture in which the removed verse makes complete sense. Don't read them as a belief system to replace the one you grew up with. Read them the way a historian reads an intelligence report from another era, trying to understand what the people who wrote it were actually observing, not just what the words look like on the surface. Here's something specific to look for when you read the Apocryphon of John. The Archons are described as having specific functions, not just general malevolence. One governs the perception of external threat. One governs the sense of inadequacy. One governs the pattern of seeking protection from outside sources rather than from interior ones. When you read that description, and then look at the verse that was removed, the voice as a boundary that shadows cannot cross, you understand something the canonical text cannot give you. The psalm was originally a counter-instruction, not comfort. Counter-programming. Two mistakes to avoid as you move into this. The first is treating the vocal practice as performance, doing it loudly or dramatically because that feels more spiritually significant. The heart math research is clear. The internal quality of attention is what produces the field coherence. A whisper with full interior attention produces a different and more coherent field than a shout with scattered attention. Volume is not the point. Presence is. The second mistake is moving from curiosity to certainty too quickly. I've watched people discover the Gnostic texts, and within 6 months they've replaced one rigid system with another one. That's not what the practice is for. What served the early practitioners was the practice itself, the daily vocal work, the interior attention, the consistent cultivation of what heart math calls coherence, and what the Gnostics called the bridal chamber. The cosmological framework is a map, not the territory. Use it where it helps, and set it aside when it stops helping. Let's close the loop on where we started. You came in knowing Psalm 23 as a pastoral poem about comfort and surrender. You now know that the manuscript tradition behind it is more complicated. The Dead Sea Scrolls suggest the Psalms were operational, not decorative. The Cairo Geniza contains a fragment with an interpolated verse describing the human voice as a protective boundary. The Gnostic Christians, through the Apocryphon of John, the Gospel of Philip, the Pistis Sophia, understood that practice in a cosmological framework involving archonic interception. The CIA Gateway Report and 30 years of heart math research have independently documented the physical mechanism the verse was pointing toward. And the neuroscience of contemplative vocal practice confirms what those Essene practitioners already knew. All of that was available, not hidden in secret libraries, sitting in Cambridge, in the CIA's reading room, in peer-reviewed journals. The question was never whether it was accessible. The question was whether anyone would put it together for you. There's significantly more here than I could fit in a single video. The archonic framework in the Apocryphon of John, the 12 governors and what each one corresponds to in terms of human perception, connects directly to this. That's a full conversation by itself. Leave signal in the comments if you want to go there next. Subscribe to Awakened Minds if you haven't. This channel builds the picture piece by piece, and this thread isn't finished. The shepherd's voice was never just a metaphor. They needed you to think it was, because the alternative, that you carry the protection with you, would have changed everything about how much you needed them. Now you know. See you in the next one.